Hello. So I have come all the way from Helsinki, way up north. I'm a researcher in Aalto University and postdoc. I did my doctoral dissertation on Fab Labs and makerspaces, and especially Tomas is going to talk more about Fab Labs after me. But what I'm interested in is, of course, distributed production, which I see is useful to understand as opposite from, or in some kind of contrast to mass production. And especially for me, sustainability is really important. So what are aspects of mass production, environmentally, socially, economically, that we want to actually mitigate or prevent and replace it with something better? So this is why I'm interested in distributed production, especially of material objects. When people share ideas, they share equipment, they share projects to be able to make things together that have local value. You can see in the photograph that this is a Fab Lab in the Netherlands. This is also where the Ultimaker was developed. Oh, a PC, where's the arrow? Control L. Thank you. I use a Mac. And I'm sorry, I don't run Linux. See?
Yes, I know.
And I'm also sorry I don't speak Spanish. So, let us continue. What was I going to say after this? What I do, I also have been living my life in Helsinki, involved in very many urban activist initiatives as well. So when I'm doing ethnography, especially in the Helsinki area, in the Fab Lab network, I feel like I operate as an insider-outsider, which is very helpful because I understand quite clearly the issues that activists face, but then also as a researcher, it allows me to step back a little bit and have some kind of academic distance. How is the microphone level? Okay. So this is why I think, especially I work a lot in design for sustainability in Aalto University, and it's very useful for designers, practitioners, and students to be able to have frameworks, guidelines, checklists, things that help us to know where we're going. Are we going in a little bit of the right direction with sustainability? And when we're talking about these new kinds of P2P systems that we want to create, it also helps us to have conceptualizations, visions, ideologies of where we want to go. But what also happens is that there's all kinds of weird, messy, dirty human things that happen when people are trying to enact these visions. And this is what I'm especially interested in. You go towards a certain vision, but what stops you? There's human dynamics, there's institutional barriers, people run out of money, all of these kinds of things. So I think that this is very interesting to me, and it's very useful for activists to be able to hear from an outsider that, hey, the barriers you face aren't only your own. Everybody has often the same problems, so we can also learn to work on how to solve them. And so because the title of my talk was about public-community collaboration, what I would like to do is give some perspective on what cities often think or don't think about these kinds of ways that a city could become more distributed and more participatory for citizens to make things, and then also from the activist perspective. So the types of communities that I'm interested in are especially shared workshops for making things. So Fab Labs and makerspaces. This is a Fab Lab in Breda, also in the Netherlands. Hack labs and hacker spaces, which operate in a little bit of a different way because they have much more of this hacker culture. They often work with membership-based kinds of models. We also have DIY biology labs that are popping up in a lot of places, either independently or in the context of a makerspace. And aside from these kinds of shared spaces, there are also many communities. I noticed this in Helsinki and other very active European cities, that Fab Labs aren't just working with sensors or 3D printers or so on, but there's lots of activists who come in and they want to do things around guerrilla gardening, community-supported agriculture, urban agriculture, and different kinds of activities, renewable energy, that are not just about making things or making furniture. So this is an urban greenhouse that is in Helsinki, run by an environmentalist group called Dodo. And they got a huge grant from the World Design Capital Foundation in Helsinki in 2012, just to be able to build this urban greenhouse to explore things around renewable energies, growing vegetables organically. They have a ponics system inside, which is based on, of course, the system of hydroponics, but it uses urine. So these activists also use the Fab Lab and the Hack Lab and so on for their activities, but they also operate independently, doing all kinds of citizen initiatives. There are also, of course, repair cafes and all types of repair events that are relevant. And in many cities, you will also see more and more makerspaces that are in institutions like libraries and museums. Helsinki is extremely active with having library makerspaces. And the first pilot one was opened in one of the Helsinki city libraries, right in the city center. It was around 2013 or thereabouts. And it was the pilot space because now, next month, they will open a huge flagship library, and there will be about 100 square meters of a makerspace there. And in the capital city region, already there are many city libraries that have makerspaces. So what's interesting also to remember about what I will just call now makerspaces, but remember that they are doing all kinds of activities in them, but is that the people are not just designing things in an open source way. They are also adopting technologies from manufacturing and bringing them down to the desktop level, and then creating new types of production technologies. But they are also adopting things from open source software, Wikipedia, and these ways of working to be able to operate in this horizontal and P2P kind of way. From the point of view of what we know about distributed production, of course, sometimes these things are hard to measure, but we know, at least at the abstract and conceptual level, that yes, there are benefits to distributed production. There are many papers. I'm not expecting you to read the slides, but just to briefly run through a few of these things. Of course, economically, we know that we want to have things like more local jobs, more product value locally. Environmentally, of course, if we reduce transport, we can have all kinds of environmental benefits. If we look at the social dimension, then what we're usually looking at is more local jobs. And often this means that we need also some kind of institutional support. So like I said, we know these kinds of things conceptually, that yes, this would be very, very good, but then what happens when these really grassroots, on-the-ground activists are trying to do their work on a very everyday-to-day basis? And I would say that there are many opportunities and benefits, but also barriers that we should look at. And one thing that I have noticed with the activists is that they are really super committed to what they're doing. They also operate in a very non-mainstream way. They don't have very middle-class lifestyles. Many of them are committed to things like dumpster diving, that they don't necessarily want to use the monopoly mass-produced industrial agriculture system for gaining their food, so they're going to operate by stealth and they get all their food by dumpster diving. But they also explore issues like peaponics or aquaponics, renewable energies in a very small scale way. Sometimes research topics that are not actually addressed or not seen as important by academia or by industry. I think this is quite important. This is a photograph that's inside the urban greenhouse in Helsinki. And you can see also what's interesting is that makers are very fluent at combining different socio-technical worlds. That you can see all kinds of mix of the technical and the biological, of 1950s technology combined with 2010s technology. And they are able to join these seams. And I think that's also quite useful and interesting. And this is also an event called Open Source Circular Economy Days, which some of you might know. And this is this cosmo-local type of event, because a city can put on an event locally, but then everyone shares challenges and information then globally on the global website. But in many of the Fab Labs that I've been looking at least in Europe, a Fab Lab really has to devote itself to sustainability, environment, and ecological issues. Otherwise, they tend to get bogged down in their everyday work. They might have some kind of ideology or vision that, yeah, I would love to work more with sustainability issues or circularity issues, but they often just don't have the time because they have so many tasks to do. So I would suggest that if you are the kind of stakeholder who wants to start a makerspace or maybe work with a makerspace in order to have some kind of sharing economy initiative, you have to be quite strategic about who you are working with, because not every makerspace, hack lab, fab lab is going to be the same. There's going to be different types of skills and expertise, different motivations, and different types of values in each lab. Some stakeholders think that they want to encourage different types of distributed manufacturing to bring actual manufacturing back to a certain region. And a fab lab might be a good place for prototyping, but there's a big jump between the prototyping at a fab lab scale and then the industrial scale of manufacturing. And sometimes the expertise is not in that fab lab that you're looking at. And another issue is also about inclusion and exclusion that even people in fab labs kind of tend to forget. There's sometimes the idea that if you build it, they will come, and it's not really that way. You open a fab lab, you throw open the doors, and you don't necessarily get the big open access crowd that you want. So you have to be quite strategic. Then again, the city library makerspaces have a very different remit. So yes, they do want to open the doors and allow everybody in, but then it's a very different way of working, because then you would have a little bit on that side where you can see that it's very inclusive. You have familiar kinds of printing service offerings and a mass audience, but it also means that it won't easily cater to very highly technical or specialized kinds of makers. The ones who really know who they are doing, the ones who might also be very, very innovative, and the ones who don't want to operate as in business as usual. If you operate this way, if you do the real counterculture, alternative, non-mainstream way, then you have possibility for completely new practices, for innovations, but you might not be very inclusive. It might be rather an exclusive, closed circle. So I think that this is something that's important to remember. Laura Filano in Chicago also did a study in Chicago on what it means to localize production in the Chicago area. And her team also found that it would be beneficial to differentiate what is the meaning of making. So they have they have making as product and business development, making as organizational innovation, making as inquiry, knowledge, and learning. And very much of the stories that you hear from Fab Labs today are definitely the latter, that Fab Labs are very good in terms of knowledge, learning, and education. This is another study from German researchers who are studying sustainable practices in Germany. You don't need to read everything on the slide, but they also found, they differentiated the activities like urban gardening or urban agriculture as type 1 do it together, and repair cafes, fab labs, and maker spaces as type 4 do it together. But then they also saw that one is very individualized, one is very communal, and they need very different kinds of support strategies. So from the city point of view, there is often a question that regional authorities might not know exactly what making is, what peer-to-peer production is, what are the values that a fab lab or a makerspace can kind of actually bring, because they don't really fall into what we understand as conventional institutions. It's not really a school, and it's not really a library, and it's not really a company. And there is, of course, the case that in this neoliberal world, the actual definition of what success is for a city might be that they want to be seen as very competitive in a global world. And innovation might be limited to only, certain types of technical innovation that brings benefits maybe only to a company. So the question then is that really what is the city for? Who is it for? Do we consider them as citizens, or do we consider them only consumers? Do we offer things as a city then that are only for individuals, or can they be also communal? And these kinds of issues. But the opportunities, if you look at activists and makers from the city point of view, is that these are really empowered makers. They're active, they are committed to their work, and they are actually experimenting with these local material flows in a way that is very exciting and can be very inspirational for others, and they can draw other citizens into these kinds of practices. In Finland, we have a problem with phosphorus flows, for example, because phosphorus flows immediately into the Baltic, and it's a terribly, terribly polluted sea. So even these tiny experiments with the peaponics that Dodo is doing in the greenhouse can be very instructive also for the regional authorities and for the academics to see, hey, can we actually have new understanding of the phosphorus flows and use it in a new way with new value. I have been collaborating a little bit with an Australian public servant called Sharon Eade, and she has done very strong advocacy work trying to promote a makerspace in her city that would be sponsored by the city and would operate as a place where citizens could experiment with circular materials. And she has suggested that it would be very beneficial that if a city would want to start or work with a makerspace, that there is not very much funding usually in city budgets, but hey, if you frame it as infrastructure, then you use the infrastructure budget for such activities, and then it would be seen as a community asset. The photograph is of a makerspace that it exists now, it's actually now being renovated, but it's in Norway, and the city actually has given Fellesverkstedet, which is a cooperative, a massive grant, 2 grants, one to actually buy an old factory, a beautiful industrial building, and number 2, to be able to renovate it so that they can set up a co-working space and a huge maker space, technology and traditional maker workshop then for Oslo's creative industries. So that these creative people, the freelancers and the small companies can come there and they can do all of their design and also making work. And I find that this is quite amazing from Oslo's point of view, that they would actually give the cooperative such a massive grant. And we look forward to when their makerspace opens. So then, if you would be thinking of a makerspace as infrastructure, then you could also consider it as a community land trust. And this happens to be the Fab Lab in Ghent that was also involved in the Commons projects that Michelle was just talking about. And yes, the lab is actually usually full of people, but I didn't get permission to actually publish them, so this is why the makerspace looks empty now. So from the barriers point of view, if we look and we talk to the activists, precarity regarding money, and usually the money has to go to the rent for the space, is really the biggest problem. Many makerspaces I know now have either closed or they are really struggling to get crowdfunding to be able to buy their building. I know one Fab Lab, they actually crowdfunded enough money to buy their building, but the city is not allowing them to buy it. They still want to sell the building to some kind of developer who will develop it into some kind of housing for high-income families, rather than support the kinds of activities that the collective is doing now, which are related to citizen science experiments, DIY bio, a Fab Lab, where entrepreneurs can prototype their products, and these kinds of issues. So this is, again, a really big struggle, and they have struggled to communicate their value of their work to a city because it's not easily understood, as I said before, because they're not a company and they're not a research institute, and it's very difficult for the more conventional thinkers at the regional level to understand their value. And what happens, of course, is that activists end up doing a lot of work. They are really the forerunners. They're living the future that all the rest of us will actually live years from now. So they do all kinds of forerunner activities that become so interesting that later others recognize the value of it and they find a way to make money of it. And activists tend to, of course, operating without money or with very low income, it is not always welcome, but activists, makers are often quite used to it, as artists and designers often are. So they don't necessarily want to get paid for their initiatives and their innovative work, but they at least would like the acknowledgement. Of course, the opportunities from the activist point of view is, again, this consciousness of the value of materials, that this is not waste to them, that they actually see everything as a resource and things that should be valorized. And what I think is important to me anyway, from the sustainability point of view, and from a really long-term and very deep, profound philosophical sense, is that these are not about like quick sustainability techno fixes, what some of us call sustainability as usual. This is really profound change. This is a deep relationship, not with the environment out there, but a deep connection between humans and nature, the living earth and the non-humans that we are trying to live our lives with. And what's, of course, I think really interesting and useful also in what the meanings of these are as we are making some kind of transition to some post-industrialism, is that it's not about what I would call the kind of Silicon Valley individualist, that it's what I'm doing is only for myself. This is also about collectives and communal work, but it doesn't mean that you have to lose your individuality, that there's something very Spinoza about this idea that we work together, but we can still be individuals with our own motivations. So in sum, I think that we really need to understand the diversity of these kinds of communities to be able to strategically choose who we want to work with and who to support and how to support them. And if we go to the idea of the commons, especially the knowledge commons, and the idea that we have different types of private goods or common pool resources compared to public goods or toll or club goods, then we can actually think of makerspaces also in these terms. So if we want a common pool resource where it's very, very inclusive, then we can have spaces in libraries. If we are okay with a little bit of exclusion, then we can have private goods, which would be like tech shops and commercial workshops. And there are many of these. They operate the same way that you would have a gym membership. You can pay a certain amount every month, and then you have access to the makerspace for free. On the other hand, we could also have toll or club goods, which would be very specialized DIY spaces, as we see in many cities. They would be very specific types of spaces oriented to agriculture or to robotics. And then at the same time, of course, we have the public goods, which are the open design repositories, which at the moment, of course, there are many, but there could be much more linking between them. They could be easier to search. It could be easier to share information. So thank you. I would be happy if you contacted me with any questions that you would have.